This is episode 1 of the Average Investors Podcast. Hey, welcome to the Average Investors Podcast. My name is Ace and I'll be your host. So just to give you guys a bit of a background on myself, I'm a software engineer by trade and I graduated from York University here in Toronto, Canada. I started this podcast because I realized a lot of the information out there doesn't help out your average person. Perhaps you're like me and you come from a single parent household. You were a student that worked at the same time, or you just don't have a lot of money to invest. Well, that's why I'm going to try my best to help you guys out and teach you the secrets that the banks and the wealthy don't want you to know. So the goal will be to ultimately teach you guys about the different ways you can invest and make your money work for you, and also kind of fight inflation, which is the rising cost to live in everyday products. So the way to do that is by investing and making your money work for you, making sure that your money isn't technically losing value each year, but gaining value. And there are many ways to invest, such as real estate, stocks, commodities, and even starting your own business. And we're going to cover all those topics, starting with a high-level overview and then going into real depth. The topic that we're going to cover today is stocks. What are they and how do you get them? To explain what stocks are, I'm going to use an example. So imagine we have an individual by the name of John that owns and operates a grocery store here in Toronto. So John's realized that his customer base has been growing more and more each month. He's also realized that his store is kind of reaching full capacity. So John has to do something about this, and John decides, hey, perhaps opening up another location would be a great idea. So John needs roughly $1,000 to be able to expand his business. So John goes out there looking for an investor that's willing to put up $1,000. Instead, he finds that people are willing to invest in his business, but for a lot less, about $100 for a smaller piece. So John gets the idea, hey, what if I can find 10 people that are willing to take a smaller piece of my company for $100 each? He can raise the $1,000 that way. So John does that. And each one of those individuals now owns a tiny share of the company. So essentially what shares are just a small piece of a company. And almost any company can become publicly traded. So what that means is the general public can now become a small owner of that company and enjoy in the company's growth and success in the form of either their share price going up or in dividends, which are company profits that are being paid out to the shareholders. Now, have you ever wondered when driving by a McDonald's or Starbucks, wow, that's a great business. They must be making a lot of money. And wishing that you can own a piece? Well, what if I told you you can, because both of those companies are publicly listed. In fact, there's plenty of publicly listed companies that you've heard of, such as Apple, GM, Ford, Walmart, TD Bank, RBC, and even your energy providers or gas providers like Enbridge, or your garbage collectors like Waste Management or Waste Connections. Now that you know what a stock is, you're probably wondering, well, how do I make money from this? Well, there's two ways. One is that the share price goes up. Now, what that means is, let's say you go to the grocery store and buy a dozen eggs for $3. And let's say some kind of crazy scenario happens where there's an egg shortage and people really want to make omelets. So you have people bidding for about $5 or $10 because they really want those eggs. And you decide, hey, you know what? I'm going to sell it. So you sell your eggs, and now that $3 to $10, you have that $7 profit margin, meaning you just made $7. But let's say that the price of those eggs has gone down because there's a influx, a very high supply and very low demand for your eggs. Well, on the market, your eggs might fetch $1 to $2 for that pack. But there is always one thing you gotta remember. Until you sell your eggs, you haven't made or lost $1. You just have your dozen eggs. And similarly with your shares, you haven't made or lost anything. You just own that piece of company. So now that we covered the first way that you can make or lose money if you sell your shares at either a higher or lower price than you've bought it for. Let's go into the second way, which is called dividends. Now, dividends are pretty cool and they honestly attract a lot of people towards stocks. So, dividends are pretty much the company paying out some of its profits back to the shareholders or owners. So, what that means is, let's say Starbucks, for example, which does pay out dividends, let's say you own a few shares of Starbucks. Well, what that will entitle you to is for each one of your shares, you're going to be paid a certain amount of money 4 times a year from the company's profits. So Starbucks currently trading at about $108 a share, pays out about 45 cents 4 times a year per share. So this is a great way to create some passive income. And also note that each year that the company does better and better, they tend to increase their dividend payout as well. So this is a great way for a lot of people to create passive income where they kind of just buy the stock and hold it forever, knowing that they're always going to be making money off of that. And being able to accumulate that money and be able to buy more and more shares and really increase that level of passive income that's coming in. Now that you've learned the two ways that you can make money from stocks, let's get into what a stock market really is. So, what a stock market is pretty much different businesses being sold on the market openly to the public for different prices. So, a similar example to this would be a grocery store where you might find chocolate or coffee or produce, different items coming from different businesses being sold at different prices. Now, just like how you buy those items from certain stores, well, you have to buy stocks from stock exchanges. So there's a few different kinds out there, like the Toronto Stock Exchange, called the TSX, the New York Stock Exchange, or even the NASDAQ. Now there's many exchanges all over the world and most countries have their own stock exchange. Now that you've learned what a stock exchange is, how you can make money from stocks, and what exactly a stock is, you're probably wondering, well, Ace, how do I buy a stock? Well, you're going to need an account for that. Now, I'm going to start off by telling you guys about the different types of accounts that you can get to start buying stocks and creating your wealth portfolio. So, in Canada, we have what's called an RRSP. And similarly, in the US, they have what's called a 401k. They both work in similar fashion. So, you take income that you made today and you put that in that account, your RRSP or 401k, and you can defer the taxes to a later date when you pull that money out from the account. Now, if that confused you a little bit, don't worry. The first time I heard of a RRSP slash 401k, I was honestly confused myself. So what that means is pretty much, let's say you're making about $50,000 this year and you're paying about $10,000 in taxes. And you decide that, hey, I don't really need all of that $50,000 this year. I can live off of $25,000. So you decide, hey, I want to put $25,000 into my RRSP account and buy some stocks, buy some ETFs with those. Well, what that's going to allow you to do is pretty much cut the amount of income that you technically made for that year to just half, which is $25,000. And you'll also be reducing the amount of taxes that you're going to be paying for that year as well. So let's say that there's a even tax bracket of about 20% for every person on the planet. And for that $50,000, you were paying $10,000 in taxes before. But now that you've put $25,000 into your 401k slash RRSP, you're only paying $5,000 in taxes for the year, meaning when it's time to file your taxes, you'll be getting a nice check back for about $5,000. So the biggest benefits of a RRSP or 401k are that you can defer the amount of money that you're paying now on taxes for a later date. Let's say you're planning on retiring in about 5 years and the money that you're making right now is more than enough. Well, what you can do with that money now is invest it for your retirement so that at least when you're retired, you can use that money as your income and reduce the amount of money that you're paying right now while getting taxed later on at a lower tax rate. So let's say, again, you're making about $100,000 today. And when you're retiring, you're putting about $50,000 each year right now. And in 10 years, when you retire, you're going to use that money up in about 10 years. Well, instead of paying a heavier amount of tax on 100,000, you're only paying it on $50,000. And while that money's away and in your RSP, it's growing and you're making money off of it. It's working for you. When you need it, it'll be there. And it's easily accessible and it's very liquid. Now, the reasons why a RRSP is very beneficial for certain people is because let's say certain years you might have a lot more income, a very high income. Well, here in Canada and in the US, we have what's called a marginal tax rate, meaning up until $45,000 here in Canada, you get charged a lower tax on that. And then as you start making more and more, those higher portions start getting taxed at a higher rate. What that means is, let's say if you're making about $100,000, I believe on above 90,000, you're going to get hit with around 20 to 30% in taxes. Now, don't quote me on that, but that's a rough estimate. Now, this type of account is really ideal for somebody that is either looking to perhaps use the money for an unstable year. Let's say you're making about $100,000 this year, and possibly you don't know if you're going to be making that money next year. Perhaps you might not make anything for next year. Well, what that allows you to do is save the amount of taxes by deferring some of that money for next year. So this is very ideal for business owners or contractors. And usually with RRSPs and 401ks, employers tend to match contributions for employees, usually full-time employees, dollar for dollar up to 4%. Now, this might be more or less in your company, but it's usually around that much. Now, what this allows you to do is literally make 100% gains on your contributions right off the bat. Now, another big benefit of the RRSP, so I'm not sure if this applies to the 401k, but here in Canada, you can actually use up to $35,000. And if you have a husband-wife, $70,000, $35,000 a piece for your first home. So if you're a first-time home buyer, you can use $70,000 from your RRSP directly towards your home, tax-free. And you do have to pay it back into your RRSP account after 15 years. So you have 15 years to be able to contribute that same amount back in there. But you can pretty much get access to $70,000 tax-free. Now that's pretty amazing. But now that we've talked about all of the positives of RRSP, what are the negatives? Well, for starters, with an RRSP or 401k, first off, you do have limitations. So your contribution amount for the year will differ for each person depending on how much money you make. And the second thing is, let's say you're retired and you may have a source of income such as a running business or some other kind of thing. Maybe you invented something really cool and you're making a lot of money from it. Well, let's say if you're making more money when you're retired and you want to pull from your RRSP or 401k, well, now you're going to have to add that amount of money as well into your income, meaning you're actually going to be paying more taxes than you would have. Now, this kind of scenario isn't as likely for everybody. In fact, most people, it's not really that likely because most of us are working career jobs, and once we retire, we're not moving a muscle. So now the second type of account is called a TFSA, or in the US, they call this a Roth IRA. So what the TFSA and Roth IRA allow you to do is pretty much take money that you've already been taxed on and use that to invest. Now, what that allows you to do is that you can make gains while not having to pay any tax on this. Now, you see what the RRSP is, that you may be deferring the tax, but at time of withdrawing that money and that income that you've made from there, you're going to have to pay taxes on that. But with the TFSA and Roth IRA, you won't have to do that. Your money is going to be completely tax-free at the time that you start taking it out. Hey guys, this podcast was brought to you by our sponsor, Anchor. If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Now let me explain. It's totally free to use. There are creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. Anchor will also distribute your podcast for you, so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. You can also make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one convenient place. Thank you. Now, let's say we have an individual by the name of John that owns a refrigerator company. Now, John's company is doing really well, and he's been contributing into his TFSA or Roth IRA for a few years now. He's been buying shares of TD Bank. Now, TD Bank pays a dividend. Now, whether he's doing good and making a lot more money this year or not making as much, if he decides to use some of that dividend income from his TFSA for his own personal use, he won't be taxed on it because the money he put in there was already after tax. So his money was already taxed before he put it into his TFSA account. So, what are the benefits of a TFSA or Roth IRA? So let's say you just got paid by your employer and you're looking at your paycheck and you can see that you've been taxed a certain amount of money on that income that you've made. Well, you can now take that money, put it into your TFSA account, and buy stocks of a company that perhaps pays a dividend and use that money as a passive income because whenever you withdraw that money from your account, that dividend income that you're making from the company's profits, you won't have to pay any taxes on that. So that's one way of setting up a passive income stream, just like how a rental property might be, and really letting your money work for you. Now, that's pretty amazing to consider. I mean, let's say if you get really good at it and your investments do really well, and you make $1 million or 10 million or $100 million, well, you won't have to pay a single dollar in taxes on that money. And you won't take a dent in any of your profits from the CRA or the IRS. That's pretty amazing. So now that we've talked about the benefits of a TFSA, let's talk about the disadvantages. So the biggest disadvantage to a TFSA is your contribution limit. So trust me, I really hate this, but you are limited to the amount that you could contribute into this account. And each year it does increase. And let's say if you haven't ever contributed into your TFSA, well, the contribution room that you had for the previous years, don't worry, it's not gone. It all accumulates. So the second disadvantage to a Roth IRA or TFSA is that you won't get any immediate tax relief. So what that means is, let's say if you're making about $50,000 a year and you put about only $10,000 into your TFSA account, well, you're not going to get any tax relief when it comes time to file your taxes. You're still going to be paying taxes on $50,000. The biggest benefit of that, though, is that $10,000, any of the money that you make off of that, you won't be paying any taxes on. So in the grand scheme of things, if your investments do very well, you'll be happier. You'll be happier not paying as much taxes. Now, the last disadvantage to a TFSA account is owning international stocks. So with the TFSA or the Roth IRA, let's say if you own with the Canadian version, the TFSA, any stocks in the US, such as Home Depot or Starbucks, well, and any dividends that you collect, you'll be paying a withholding tax. And it's the same way with the Roth IRA. So if you own any non-US stocks with the Roth IRA, such as Canadian TD Bank, any dividends that you get will be taxed by that foreign country. Now, that's very important to note because depending on how you plan on investing and the strategy that you plan on taking, you might want to use different accounts for those different purposes. So that about wraps up today's podcast, and that's episode 1. And I want to leave you guys with a little bit of a pep talk before we go. So perhaps you're curious and just learning about investing for the first time. Perhaps you own a portfolio that you're just not quite sure of exactly what's happening behind the scenes. Or perhaps you're already an avid investor that's just trying to get another aspect on ideas that you may already know or perhaps may not know. Well, all of you guys are welcome here, and I thank you guys for being on this podcast and listening to episode 1. But there is one big thing that I got to teach you guys. No matter how much money you may make, whether it's $1,000 or $100,000 in a year, we have to always think about the bigger picture. We got to understand that $5 cup of Starbucks every day, that $10 lunch every day, it all adds up. When you take all of it into consideration, you got to remember that a share of, let's say, ZRE, which is a REIT, a REIT ETF, that's about $22 a share. That earns you 9 cents every month for the rest of your life. And that's just saying that, hey, the dividends don't increase, which they will increase. That we're letting go of that just to eat out for a day and have a coffee outside for a day. We're going to try to change your mindset. We're going to make sure that we can give you better tips, better habits, and make you understand that the long-term goal is much more worth it than that $5 cup of Starbucks for the day or that $10 meal. Now, thank you guys so much. Stay tuned for episode 2.